Well, hello everyone. It's been a while. I'm coming to you today from the shop on what is essentially my last day of work before my annual fall holidays. And so I thought I would, sort of finishing up some projects, and I got a little bit more time on my hands than usual. I guess I scheduled things okay. Usually it's pretty frantic around here, but this is Friday and I've got a little bit of time. I'm just finishing up the classic Chevy frame overhaul here. It's a subframe from a unitized construction car, nice big block Chevy, and getting all the springs and bushings and ball joints and steering arms, steering box, idler arm, all that stuff bolted back up. I got a little more to do yet to sort of make it a kind of a wheelbarrow rolling chassis, I guess, right? Because it's not a complete frame, it's just the front subframe. But essentially it'll allow the fellow who's sort of rebuilding the car overall to be able to move it around in his garage while he, works on the car, probably over the winter, I'm guessing. And then, of course, the old Datsun there, which was a bit of a long-term project. Neither one of these are sort of my normal thoroughfare. I work on mostly contemporary vehicles, your sort of classic automotive repair shop stuff, quite contemporary vehicles, maintenance, diagnosis, repairs, your standard issue stuff. I don't do wheel alignments or tires, but I do most everything else. Having been a dealership technician for almost 20 years prior, I'm well versed in electrical diagnosis and all of those things. Was quite well trained, I think, in that regard. And so these are just kind of projects that have been waiting around for me to finish up. It's kind of stuff I'd made the corporate decision not really to do anymore, but I'd already pledged that I would do these some time ago, and I wasn't going to go back on that, but it's really just too disruptive to the shop normal flow. This Datsun's been in here for many months waiting for me to get a chance to finish it up. And of course it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. The Datsun's making me less efficient in the shop because I'm down to one bay, and so that means less time to get back to the Datsun to finish it up and get it out of my way. Reluctant, to sort of contemplate how much it's actually kind of cost me in lost productivity over the summer. But what I wanted to discuss today actually was a couple of videos I saw and something that I've been thinking about for quite some time. These are recent videos, and just to sort of discuss the current state of the automotive industry. This relates to automotive mechanical repair. Of course, it relates to new vehicle sales and what people do with their vehicles. And this relates to two videos I watched recently by two channels that I follow. I actually don't follow a lot of automotive channels for an automotive mechanic, but there are a couple that I do. One is Ford Tech Maculoco. He's very good. I think he probably is a former dealership tech that's gone on his own, similar to myself. He's a Ford mechanic. I was a General Motors dealership technician before this. And he's got a really good channel. Really good-natured guy, lots of good information on there, and just kind of entertaining to watch if you are technically minded. The other one is Uncle Tony's Garage, I believe it is, and he's a little bit different. I enjoy his content. He's probably closer to my age, and he does lots of Mopar high-performance stuff, like classic Mopar high performance and other things as well. He does lots of videos exposing bad restorations, what to look out for. And he does discuss the current state of the automotive repair industry and automotive manufacturing industry. The video in particular that I watched first was Ford Tech Maculoco's channel recently, where he discussed a $5,600 taillight repair to, I think it was a 2018 F-150 Limited. So this is a top-of-the-line truck, for the F-150 line. And really what it stemmed from was the massive integration of all of the computer software, networking, and accessories added. In this case, the real culprit here was, improper sealing, let's say, of the taillight housing and related connectors. The truck was clean too. I mean, this wasn't as though it was some sort of a vehicle that's used on the out in the oil patch, as they call it in Canada, right? Way out in the middle of nowhere, running over really bad roads, muddy, huge bumps, and being abused. This thing looks like a pavement princess. But because of the side object detection system, you've actually got modules, computers, in the taillight housings themselves. Not to mention the LED taillights, which by themselves are always quite expensive if they don't have some sort of a replaceable component for the bulb itself, which most of them don't, at least to my knowledge. And because these side object detection sensors and modules are in the taillights, anything that affects the taillights in terms of any moisture intrusion is going to affect those. Because of the way the whole computer system and networking on the vehicle is integrated, anything that affects one computer on the network, and there are several networks, most people don't realize, there can be up to 5 different types of networks, even on a single vehicle. Now, they don't all have 5 different types, but if you can imagine in the early days of automotive manufacturing with electronics, they had a simple fuel injection system, electronic fuel injection. They might have added an anti-lock brake system or an airbag system at some point. But these were quite rudimentary networks. They didn't need to communicate at high data speeds. And this was in the infancy of this kind of networking. So they had one network on the car where these various computers, 2, 3, 4 computers, could communicate with each other. But over time, they realized they needed to have higher speeds. They needed to increase the baud rate of the connection between these computers so that they could communicate more effectively, especially when you're trying to integrate advanced functions between, let's say, an engine computer and an anti-lock brake / traction control computer. You need those things to discuss things amongst themselves really, really quickly because the events happen very quickly. And so they developed faster networks. But some of the legacy networks stayed behind because there was no need to reinvent the wheel for these things that didn't need to communicate more rapidly. And so you ended up with cars with several different types of networks on board and some computers on board that actually had access to more than one of those networks. A good example would be a body computer, which is communicating with the engine computer in terms of security alarms and immobilization, or the air conditioning computer with regards to climate control, and of course with other computers on board as well for many different aspects of the vehicle. And so you end up with these lots of different networks. When you have water intrusion on a network and it causes erratic voltages on the communications line, either some sort of a short to ground, and it doesn't need to be a direct short to ground like someone took a wire, cut it open and just held it to the body structure somewhere. No, it can be what I would call a parasitic short to ground. In other words, a connection that's allowing a few electrons here and there to jump, that degrades the signal, the digital communication between these modules. Or of course, anything that isn't an open circuit is going to cause the computer that's on that particular branch of the harness not to be able to communicate. Other modules will pull, the modules will pull each other often. Sometimes you have what's called a power mode master. This would be one computer whose job it is to pull all the modules on the data stream and make sure they're all, reporting for duty. And if they don't, well, then they start to throw codes. They start to set warning messages, error messages saying we can't communicate with each other. And anything that causes other voltages to sort of parasitically leak into the data line. Let's say you've got a connector that has a 12-volt power signal, a ground signal, and then a data signal all in one connector, and water gets in that connector. Well, now electricity can actually use the moisture, of course, as a conductive path to transmit some battery voltage into a data line, and now all the computers on that same network can't communicate. In the industry, we would call it pulling that voltage low or pulling it high, depending on whether it was going to ground or to battery voltage. Either way, it's the same effect because these digital signals can't communicate on a line that has a constant high or low voltage. And so these taillights got moisture in them, and long story short, he found the problem. It ended up being corroded connectors, water right inside the taillights, ended up having to get new modules, new taillights, new harness connectors, the whole works, to the tune of about $5,600. Now, Uncle Tony's Garage, his video was sort of saying this is going to be a golden age for mechanics going forward because of the way they're building these vehicles, and not everyone can afford a $5,600 taillight repair. Keep in mind, these F-150s are all aluminum as well, so any kind of, the only thing that would make that situation worse would be, let's say, if the truck got rear-ended. Because then you would have the taillight damage plus a whole bunch of aluminum body repair to do as well, and that's extremely expensive. Now you might say, well, that's why you have insurance. Yeah, insurance companies make money. So whenever someone says, oh, you got insurance, that might help on an individual basis, but it drives costs up for everyone. We all pay eventually. Anyway, the thumbnail for Uncle Tony's Garage said, something, he was referencing Cuba, something along the lines of, we're about to be like Cuba. And I think what he's referring to there, of course, is in Cuba, when the embargoes started, you ended up with all those American cars that were there up to about 1958, 59. You'll see the occasional 1960 there. I don't know, how those got there, but you'll see them. I've seen them. And if you look at them today, the majority of them do not have an original motor. They do not have an original front axle or rear axle. A lot of them have had, sort of Russian vehicle parts grafted in, let's say. And that's what he's referring to, right? As these vehicles aged out, and the Cubans have a love for those American vehicles. They could get parts from Russian vehicles and other vehicles, but they couldn't, because of the embargo, they couldn't get the American parts. And so they would, these very, lots of ingenuity going on here, lots of roadside mechanics and guys working under a lean-to would put a diesel 4-cylinder engine in a 57 Buick and a 4x4 live axle in the front of it, or even a two-wheel drive, but live axle in place of a bunch of failed independent front suspension on a two-wheel drive American car. So you got, and a big rear diff, a full floating rear axle in an American car. And so these things, they sit funny, they sound funny, but of course they've been able to keep them on the road by doing this. Now, I guess what I differ in with Uncle Tony's Garage is in his assessment that, let's say for instance, this Ford F-150 Limited could be so retrofitted by ingenious mechanics, people with a lot of knowledge, especially people who've worked on the older cars and have worked for, let's say, when they were younger, fixing things for their family because their family couldn't afford to take the vehicle to a repair shop. This is sort of my case. Or hot rodders who are used to repurposing parts and finding parts that work better and modifying a car away from its sort of original design and design intent. And I'm just not so sure with the current crop of vehicles. Not that I'm saying you couldn't make a Frankenstein out of a 2018 F-150 Limited and sort of downgrade the whole truck away from the LED taillights and away from electric power steering and away from the advanced engine electronics and all of this. But the thing is, to actually do that in the real world would be cost prohibitive. I don't think there would be any point to it unless you were doing it for yourself and you could have the vehicle in your garage for 2 years while you worked through all the bugs, because of course part of the problem is the deep integration of all these systems. And it reminds me of when I started noticing this. It was interesting that Tony, I'm guessing his name is, on Uncle Tony's Garage, he had said he'd started to see this in about 2010. And I think probably both of us, why I'm saying that is that's when I sort of noticed the problem as well. And it's gotten exponentially worse since then. And I think we both had inklings of it before then. It was when it became really obvious and apparent and very conscious to both of us. My story is sort of emblematic of what's happened ever since then on a larger and larger scale. I had a 2004 Chevy Trailblazer. So it was a vehicle that was 6 years old at the time. and the power windows didn't work. And so I brought it in and I diagnosed it, and it turned out that it was a faulty power window switch / module. So this is one of the vehicles, of course. General Motors had started adopting this sort of multi-module interconnected network with the year 2000 Buick LeSabre. That was their first car with like all the electronics, and they were boasting about how they'd reduced, the weight of wire they reduced in the car was something like 150 pounds, something along those lines. And it did simplify a lot of things, even though it added complexity. For instance, it used to be on a luxury car with, all the power windows and power door locks and power mirrors and all of these lighting and all of these speakers in the door. Used to be that a car like that had a wiring harness like this going through the hinge point between the body and the door to feed all of these things. And of course, with repeated opening and closing of the door, you've got this flexing of the wires, which causes work hardening over time, and quite often you would have a complaint where the power locks or the power window wouldn't work, and you would find when you pulled back the conduit, the rubber boot attaching the door to the hinge pillar to keep the moisture out, broken wires inside. And that's always been a pain to fix because you don't have you can't really get the harness out where you can fix it real well. You try to. It's really nice when they have a connector somewhere just inside that pillar that you can undo and then feed the whole wire out through the door and get it in front of you to make all the necessary repairs and then feed it back in. Or some manufacturers have actually made a reasonably priced replacement harness, which is even better, because when you splice wires that have been work hardened, they're just going to, now you've put a stiff point where your splice is, and they're just going to work harden and flex on both ends of that splice, and it's going to happen again. So with the electronics, with a computer in each door now, in theory, now they don't do this, but in theory you could get away with 3 to 5 wires. You would have a power, a ground, a data line, a communications line, and maybe 2 speaker wires. Now, for whatever reasons, the manufacturers have not always done that. I see some parts coming in, so I'll pause this for just a moment. All right, well, that was nice. It was actually one of the parts girls. I was wondering when I saw her coming down the driveway, I don't have any parts on order. It's my last day, right? And I don't have any needs. She was coming by to drop off a card because we lost our dog a couple weeks ago, and she'd interacted with him quite a bit, and he was my buddy. And so sympathy card for my wife and I. This parts driver in particular really liked the dog, and so she was really heartbroken when I told her that we had to say our goodbyes. So it was very sweet of her to drop by a card, and so I'll open that later with my wife. Anyway, getting back to the discussion about sort of retrofitting and fixing and sort of the new Cuban mechanic existing in North America and parts beyond, the integration of these vehicles is so vast. And so getting back to about 2010, I came to this discovery, diagnosed this Trailblazer with a power window switch, which is a computer, and then I started looking for one. Now keep in mind, the vehicle at that point is 6 years old, and I found out that the part was obsolete. And that's a problem, of course, because it's not like some old car in Cuba where you could say, well, if the switch doesn't work, we'll just wire in a toggle switch. There you go, your window works. We just rerouted the wiring to a different switch, and away you go. Well, this computer is a module. So all the other functions don't work as well. And that means you can't open any of the windows or move any of the locks or do anything that switch does. Those functions are all disabled because the brain is not working. Luckily for that customer, I did find some dealer stock in Texas or somewhere where we did a dealer exchange. The dealer here in British Columbia was able to do a warehouse inventory search, find the part. It was something like, it was slate gray instead of medium antelope or whatever the color, because it had the trim of the door panel as part of it. But of course, the customer didn't mind about the color if they had a working door switch, and we were able to fix that vehicle. But I just thought, ooh, they're obsoletizing vehicles in 6 years now? And I knew that was the beginning, right? It was pretty blatant at that point. Even though it was one experience, I knew that this is going to be a problem. And of course, the manufacturers, whether it's engineers sort of justifying their position or whatever, they seem to keep reinventing the wheel unnecessarily. You know, you would think if you were looking at something objectively, you might say, well, the thing to do is to just keep perfecting your design. But once you've perfected a part of design, then you would just keep using that known good quantity and not keep reinventing it. And they just seem to keep reinventing everything, and parts that once worked, like let's say an alternator, an AC Delco alternator, where we never used to have any problems, they re-engineer the thing and make it slightly smaller, 5% or 10% smaller packaging wise, but suddenly now they're failing left, right, and center electrically. And that's kind of false economy in my book. And that's kind of the way things are. So I'm not sure I agree with Tony when he says that this is going to be a renaissance for mechanics vis-a-vis taking these highly integrated vehicles and sort of retrofitting them with older or sort of known components, you know, making one vehicle out of two or whatever. At least not as a business and not in a total vehicle way. Even this F-150 Limited would be very difficult, because let's say you say, okay, well, we're just going to scrap the side obstacle avoidance system and we're just going to put in standard F-150 taillights, even if we got to butcher the harnesses and rewire them, because of course you've got other computers that are in the mix. In particular, probably, I don't know for sure on that F-150, I haven't looked up the wiring schematics yet, but I would surmise that, like most vehicles now, your turn signal switch is not sending voltage to those bulbs. Your turn signal switch is simply an input to a body computer, and the body computer is now sending a signal, probably in this case to rear modules, which then supply voltage to the LED tail lights, or the body computer might be sending voltage all the way back there. But either way, the body computer is going to notice when there are differences in resistance values across the circuit. So in order to change those things, you might have to add some resistors or something like that to get the body computer to ignore the fact that you've changed the type of bulb you were actually using. The big problem, though, with disabling the side obstacle avoidance system is if you're a professional shop, you can't do that. You got liability here. I've had many people who have an ABS problem, let's say, and the ABS light is always on and it's doing funny things when they try to stop, and they ask me if I could disable their anti-lock brake system. Well, no, I can't disable your seat belts either, or your airbag. You know, any safety device that I disable is a massive liability for obvious reasons. You know, if they ever get into an accident, no one's going to care that the customer requested this. It doesn't matter how many disclaimers you put on your invoice. You're supposed to know better. You're the professional, and you just can't be doing that stuff. So this is an instance right there. I had recently as well, you know, with the chip shortages making a lot of these problems worse, but around about April of this year, I had a customer come in with a lifted 2016 Chevy half-ton pickup, and he actually came in for a check engine light, and when I drove the vehicle into the shop, I noticed when I went to turn, every quarter turn, half turn, no, quarter turn, the steering wheel would get stiff, and then it would loosen up again, and then stiff, and loosen up. And obviously, I can't ignore that. What's going on here? So I put it up on the hoist, and I realized that the steering column has an intermediate shaft between it and the power steering rack. And that steering shaft, because it has to make, you know, kind of a change in angle, has a universal joint on it. In this case, it has two universal joints because the lift had to extend the length of that intermediate shaft by 8 inches or something like that, and it was enough that it required a second universal joint, which was part of the lift kit that someone had installed, and that was the universal joint that was failing. You could see rust dust coming out of the caps of the little universal joint. It was clearly seizing up, and that's why the wheel was so stiff. So, no good deed goes unpunished. I told the customer, hey, I don't know if you've noticed this. Oh, yeah. So I had to do a whole bunch of research because he had bought the truck lifted. He didn't know what the manufacturer of the lift was, and I had to do a bunch of research to find that out. Long story short, I finally sourced some parts. It's like $600 worth of parts. Got to do what you got to do. Got it in, replaced it. And when I replaced it, I started it up, and on the hoist still, because I wanted to quickly check underneath and make sure everything was okay with the engine running, I started it up and the wheels just turned all the way to the left by themselves. Rut-row. And this truck has an electric power steering rack. So instead of traditional hydraulic assist, this has got an electric motor. It's sort of a belt drive inside there with a very sensitive sensor mechanism on what would otherwise be called a spool valve in a traditional hydraulic power steering rack. And something obviously in that system had failed, probably because of the extra force that was being pushed on the input shaft of the rack, damaged the sensing mechanism in there. That part of it's non-serviceable. I think you can get some parts for the actual assist component, the belt and the motor drive, but the rest of it is non-serviceable. And the thing has a pull to the left. It's not real strong. The only reason that it turned to the left for me when I put it on the hoist was because the wheels were off the ground, very little resistance there. I took it for a road test and it had a pull to the left, but it was easily correctable. But of course, you can't guarantee that, right? You don't know if it's going to get stronger at some point or what it's going to do. When something is malfunctioning, all bets are off as to trying to predict what it's going to do as time goes on. And so we waited for months. They want somewhere around the neighborhood of $3,600 for an electric power steering rack. There are some cheaper remanufactured options, but they're only cheaper by a few $100s. They're still almost $3,000. And we waited for many months, and our back orders weren't getting filled. Finally, I owned up to the customer that, hey, I still can't get parts. It's been sitting here in my parking lot all this time, since about April. And I'm going on holidays for several months. You know, I do this every fall. So, you know, if you'd like your truck back, maybe, you know, not that he can drive it, of course, but he had moved in that time. Maybe the thing to do would be to have the truck towed to your new city and transfer the back order to the dealer there, because I don't know when I'm going to be able to get parts. And then do you want to have to come back here to get your truck and all that? Maybe we should just do this now. And so we did do that, but he still doesn't have a power steering rack, an electric power steering rack. And ostensibly that's because of the whole chip shortage issue, which many people have had problems with, transmission computers and other things. General Motors has had big problems with those and can't get parts to fix them. So some of the dealer back compound, like fenced in lots, are full of customer vehicles awaiting a transmission computer because they're not working properly and they can't get a new one, and they can't even get rebuilt ones available. So the point of all of this, of course, is what if you, per Tony here, Uncle Tony, what if you said, okay, well, let's retrofit it to a hydraulic power steering gear instead of an electric one? And I just don't see that as feasible. You know, unless the whole situation went the way of Cuba, right? Where you didn't have to worry so much about liability, insurance, and all of those things, because everybody's just in a more of a survival mode instead of a litigious sort of society and a regulated society like we have. And I'm not campaigning for that either necessarily, but I just don't see how you could say, okay, we can't get an electric power steering rack, let's retrofit a hydraulic one. Logistics of that aside, I mean, all of the, you know, some of these vehicles with electric power steering racks may not even have an option for bracketry and a pump and lines, hoses, and all of that available at all. So you'd really be stretching things. I'm not saying it can't be done. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you couldn't take the 2018 F-150 Lightning and somehow retrofit it with like a 1970s Ford powertrain, or even a 1980s create your own harness for a 5.8 EFI engine and you know, an E4OD transmission and all that stuff into a 2018 limited body. I'm just saying that unless you were just doing that for yourself, it would be cost prohibitive. Nobody would pay for that. What I think is more likely than Uncle Tony's suggestion, outside of simple isolated things, which, you know, lots of people have sort of already been doing that. There's lots of cars running around that have sort of been patched up with some component that's failed and parts are hard to get or they're too expensive, where somebody retrofits something else that will work and it largely functions as is. I'm sort of talking more about these big integrated systems that are going to be very difficult to circumvent without having to redo the whole bloody vehicle because of the downstream cascading effects of having computers offline and not being able to communicate with each other, and the way that the architecture of these vehicles almost prevents you from running it like that. Like this F-150 Limited, it got to the point where it wouldn't start. That's what actually prompted the guy to be forced to get it fixed, because of moisture in the taillights, right? Because it took the whole network down, and eventually computers just said, we can't get the data we need, we can't communicate, we're not starting. That's what's going to happen, right? So what I think is more likely, again, outside of isolated little repairs here and there that'll work, when it comes to these newer vehicles, which I wouldn't own one, I'll tell you this, and I certainly wouldn't own one with all the bells and whistles. I mean, part of the problem with that Limited is all the bells and whistles. That's why it's so expensive, and that's why it's so sensitive. But what's more likely going to happen is probably mid-2000s, and in some cases later 2000s, like 2008, 2007, 6, maybe 9, maybe 10, and back. I think you're going to see a lot of those vehicles being repurposed, being rebuilt, being seen not anymore as a vehicle that's aged out and you'll either give it to a Make-A-Wish Foundation or some charity, where they recycle a car and donate it to somebody or any of that, but actually kept or even actively sought and purchased in order to rebuild. I've even thought of this with my wife's car. My wife drives a 2006 Nissan X-Trail, and I really like the car actually. It's gutless as all hell. It's got no power. However, it's decent on fuel, it's all-wheel drive, it's got heated fabric seats, which here in Canada is really nice. Leather is a pain in the ass, and with heated leather seats, you're sort of like really cold and uncomfortable till you get warm, and they're still never really that pliable. Heated fabric seats are dynamite because they're comfortable as soon as you get in, and then they just get warm, and it's warm fabric. Who doesn't like that? And the car's been really good, and so I've always thought maybe I ought to look for another X-Trail and just build the thing, like just put it over where the Datsun here is, and just go through it with a fine-tooth comb and build everything up, whatever it needs, and have that ready to replace her existing one. Even though it's a 2006, it's been a good car. Many that I would recommend, especially if you don't need all-wheel drive or you don't need the space of an SUV, would be kind of any Toyota Camry or Corolla or Honda Civic or Accord up to about 2014 or so, but especially in light of this whole mass integration and retrofitting cars to keep them on the road thing, you probably want to be prior to 2010. And those cars are very good. They tend to be fairly conservatively engineered, and I think you could easily keep those on the road for a long time versus what's been happening in the last 8 to 10 years with these high dollar components that aren't really utilized for very many model years in a row, that haven't been picked up by the aftermarket auto parts industry as far as a reliable, inexpensive, or cost-effective alternative to the factory parts, and also the factories obsoletizing these parts so early on, because of course you can only warehouse so many parts. And so when you keep reinventing the wheel every year, this is not environmentally sound, obviously, that practice. As consumers, we would do well to demand that there be, some more consistency in the manufacture of automobiles, and stop demanding the shiny bauble and the bells and the whistles and the new designs and all of this, but start demanding, more reliable design that can spread the model range, the year range and model range of replacement parts, so that they can be stocked longer and keep vehicles on the road longer, because that's actually the most environmentally sound way to operate a motor vehicle, is to keep it on the road as long as you can to offset the environmental impact and the cost of manufacture in the first place. I mean, when they first came out with onboard diagnostics 2, the sort of mandated universal standard in North America for the way your scan tool operates when you plug it in, the universal plug-in adapter on the dashboard. I always thought, yes, they should do the same with onboard computers as well, right? Because your computer in the home, it can do a million different things. It's whatever the software is that you put in. It can be an accounting computer, it can be a music computer, it can be a photography or video editing computer, it can be a media computer, it can be anything you want it to be. And I always thought, they should standardize computers in cars too. Get rid of all the proprietary computers, get rid of all the proprietary connectors, and have like 5 computers, and they're generic, right? They all have to be the same between all manufacturers. And you would just have a micro, a mini, a medium, a large, and an extra large computer. And of course, you would just use the computer size that you require for whatever the system is that you're running. And then you would just, of course, plunk in all your software. They would have several 80-pin connectors or something like that available for them so that you can have all the wiring that you need for whatever the computer's function is, and make that universal so that when someone's computer fails. I mean, I've had, I think it was a 2009 Audi A3. I could be wrong on the model, but it was something like that. It was a 2009, and this was in about 2015. Same thing, I couldn't get a computer for it. And the computer was what had failed. The injectors I think had failed, and they shorted, and that shorted and damaged the injector drivers inside the computer. But long story short, no computer available. So then you're left looking for a used one, hoping you can reprogram it for that car. In a lot of vehicles, it has to be programmed for that car or it won't work. And a lot of vehicles, some of them are VIN locked, so once they're programmed for a certain vehicle with the serial number, they can't be used for something else. So there's lots of computers that you can't repurpose. Anyway, it's a long rant, but I think it's interesting to note what the manufacturers have done. They've kind of, in a way, especially if things get, economically worse, they've kind of obsoletized their own products in a way by making them so highly integrated, so sophisticated, with not conservative engineering. This is one thing I've always liked about Toyota. As a former GM dealership mechanic, when I worked on a lot of Toyotas, especially things like Tacomas and Corollas and Camrys, not Camrys so much, they're a little bit sophisticated, but the Corolla and the Tacoma, for instance, they're very conservatively engineered, and this stuff just works. I mean, it works really well. They're highly reliable, especially like 2014 and previous. Man, you cannot beat a Toyota Tacoma. They're kind of like the best vehicle on the planet for my money. And I really appreciate that conservative engineering, and especially now, because something like that F-150 Limited is certainly not conservative by any stretch of the imagination. And sure, that guy had the $5,600, I guess, to pony up and fix that vehicle, but that's just one problem. I worked on a 2017 EcoBoost here recently, 2.7 or 3, I can't remember if it was the 2.7 or the 3.5. Anyway, it was an EcoBoost F-150, small V6 with twin turbochargers, and it had an alternator not charging, and I ended up finding that there was a problem between the alternator field and sense circuits from the alternator to the computer, because the computer does the voltage regulation on most modern vehicles, right? Because then it can compensate for loads, and it can anticipate loads. Like when you turn on the air conditioning, it's already anticipated that and is boosting the charging rate accordingly before the compressor even engages. And I found that there was an open circuit somewhere in that harness, and it was quite something because, and most vehicles are built this way. I say this not because it's an outlier, but because it's the way things are now. Somewhere in the harness between the alternator, which is on the lower driver's side of the engine bay, and the harness goes down the side of the engine, across underneath, up the right-hand side, the passenger side of the engine, over to the firewall or inner fender, and up to the firewall from there. And that harness is pulled so tight, and the wires are like, I don't know what it was, 20 or 22 gauge, which for the uninitiated is a very small wire. And that's what they've been doing. They've been reducing weight and reducing material costs in vehicles by reducing the wire thickness to as little as they can possibly get away with, which works when the vehicle's brand new off the showroom floor, but over time, when something happens, there's not that many strands of copper there to resist corrosion if there's a pinhole in the insulation, or to resist any kind of flexing, which will work harden the few strands of copper that are in there and eventually break and form an open circuit. And a lot of mechanics are tempted to bypass that circuit and run another wire, and I can see why, because it's a nightmare to try to pull that harness apart, untape it all, get it out of the conduit, and try to effect a proper repair, at least replace the wire inside the harness, from wherever you need to splice it, so that the same wire color is continuous through the harness for future diagnosis or anything like that. And also in mind that you're dealing with a harness like this, full of other very small gauge wires that don't like a lot of manipulation and trauma, and you're so worried the whole time about inducing a new problem. What if I get all this done, wrap the harness all up, get it all back in place, and fire it up and I got a different problem? So anyway, those are just some thoughts on the whole state of the automotive manufacture and repair, and those 2 videos, I'll link them below. They're interesting, if nothing else. I think even if you don't have a mind, sort of a mechanical mind, I think they're interested just as a consumer insight into what these guys are thinking. Like I said, I think Tony's probably half right. I think there's a lot of vehicles that are going to be retrofitted piecemeal, little things here and there that can be done. But when it comes to some of these larger problems, like an electric power steering rack that you can't get, again, there would be liability even if you could logistically, let's say you do figure out how to make it a hydraulic power steering gear. What if that fails somehow and you're the one who did it, right? You're the one who modified a pre-existing system, and it's clearly a safety system. Are you on the hook for that? Maybe not in the way you would be if you disabled an ABS system or an airbag system, but I would have to wonder. I wouldn't do it. So I think, he's half right. Where he's wrong, I think, is that what I see happening is a lot of these sort of mid-2000s and previous vehicles being reinvigorated and kept on the road, at least by people who sort of see what's happening. And there could be a lot of F-150 Limiteds and who knows what else for sale that sort of can't be repaired in a way, or going cheap because the people don't have the resources for a $5,600 taillight repair. Let me know what you think. I appreciate that. And I might make a few videos in the next little while because I'm starting my fall holidays now, and I wouldn't mind touching base a little bit more. And I have a couple of responses that I wanted to make on one of my last videos. A very thoughtful person left a very long comment. I can't remember their username, and I've been meaning to respond to it the whole time, but I wanted to do it in video format because there's just a lot of stuff to chew on there. Thanks as always for watching. Bye for now.